Thank you for coming to this talk. The title of this talk is The Impact of Texture and Task Manipulation on L2 Learning from Reading. And in this talk, I'm going to highlight the potential of the impact of task manipulation and texture modification on L2 learning from L2 reading. The motivation of the series of my study comes from the relationship between L2 learning and L2 reading. L2 reading performs two important functions. One is important language skill that most learners pursue to develop. At the same time, it is a source of comprehensible input. That is, if you read a lot, it is more likely that you can develop your competence as a result of reading. And indeed, the two components share some symbiotic relationship. That is, if you have greater L2 knowledge, it will enable you to achieve a higher level of L2 reading comprehension. And as a result of reading, you will develop your L2 competence at the same time. So they share some symbiotic relationship. And given that, we need to design L2 reading tasks in such a way to develop both L2 reading comprehension skills, but at the same time, acquisition of L2 structures contained in that L2 reading tasks. And thus far, texture modification techniques have been the popular way to address this issue. And there are three popular texture modification techniques. One is texture simplification, the next one is glossing, and then input enhancement. When it comes to texture simplification, we simplify the L2 reading text by using high-frequency words, fewer idioms, fewer pronouns, simpler syntactic structures, and reducing text length. And the purpose of doing this is to assist L2 learners' reading comprehension. And by simplifying those linguistic features of L2 reading text, we expect that perhaps learners have to use less attention resources for comprehending the text, and the surplus attention resources can be driven to noticing and acquiring new L2 features contained in the L2 reading text. However, research findings have shown that texture simplification may have some facilitative effects on L2 reading comprehension, but not so much for facilitating L2 learning from L2 reading, because comprehension and acquisition, they are two different concepts. They are closely related, but comprehension does not guarantee acquisition. The next popular texture modification technique is glossing. Glossing is providing meaning of unfamiliar words, usually in the text margin. And by doing so, we expect that learners will have less processing burden in terms of access to their mental lexicon, which will in turn results in better reading comprehension. And by annotating the word meanings in the text margin, we also expect that learners may be able to notice that form, meaning connection in this process of reading, which results in learning of those lexical items. And research results have shown that glossing indeed have some facilitative effects on lexical learning, although the effect sizes have been relatively small. And what was also interesting is that many of the previous studies, such as Holton, Laufer, Keating, and Kim and Co., they found that when glosses were embedded in composition tasks, somehow the impact of glossing was maximized, boosted effect when embedded in composition tasks. So it seems like we could see that potential that perhaps we can heighten the efficacy of glossing by manipulating some task features. And input enhancement has also been widely researched in our field. It is typographical manipulation of the target structure by using various devices, such as underlining, coloring, boldfacing, italicizing, capitalizing, or highlighting. And you assume that by enhancing that saliency of those features, learners may be more likely to notice those target features while reading, which results in learning of those features. And research findings have been inconclusive. There is no clear evidence that input enhancement has positive impact on learning of those enhanced features without having any deteriorative impact on reading comprehension. And what I'm proposing here is that we also need to consider the impact of reading task manipulation. So what is a task? Task is a meaning-oriented activity that requires learners to use a target language in order to achieve a specified objective. And unfortunately, little attention has been paid to input-based tasks that requires learners to process some task input in the form of listening or reading, and then responding to the task input in the form of speaking or writing. And in the field of L1 eye tracking studies, the impact of task manipulation on reading processes have been reported. That is, according to Redak et al., it was found that reading goals change the way the text is processed. And according to Kakinen and Jonah, task-relevant features, sentences, are read more carefully and remembered better. And based on these findings, McCrudon and Shaw proposed the goal-focusing model of relevance, saying that pre-reading instruction set the criteria for determining relevance of textual information, the task goal, which in turn affects reading processes as well as learning from reading. In other words, by changing the task goal, by changing the pre-reading instruction, we can change the way learners process the text and going one step further, learning from that reading. And in the field of L2 reading studies, there are some interesting think aloud studies that shows the potential impact of task goals on L2 reading. For instance, Horibas studies have shown that task instruction affects reading behaviors and allocation of mental resources, which is manifested more clearly in reading processes rather than comprehension outcomes. In other words, if we manipulate a task in terms of its goal, requirement, steps, etc., its impact will be manifested more clearly from the reading process as reflected in their think aloud protocols or eye tracking movements, rather than comprehension scores as measured by some multiple choice items or summary writings, closed task, and etc. Let's assume that this is worthwhile to explore. Then we need some theoretical rationale to base our research. And one useful theoretical framework to explain this is Khalifah Ware's cognitive processing model for reading comprehension. According to Khalifah Ware, depending on the reading goal, readers engage in different permutation of careful, that includes slow, sequential, and incremental reading processes, and expeditious, quick, selective, and efficient reading process. So depending on the reading goal, we may be go back and forth between these two types of reading processes. Having said that, I think it seems possible to assume that by manipulating various task features, for instance, task complexity or task condition, we can affect the way learners process the text, because they will process the components that seems to be particularly relevant to task goals, right? And then, which in turn manifested in the amount of L2 learning from engaging in that L2 reading task. So what I'm proposing is that we may need to explore more about the impact of task manipulation, and preferably in combination with textual modification, and how it can promote L2 learning from L2 reading. So what I suggest is that task manipulation may change the way a text is processed and thereby affect the efficacy of textual modification. Indeed, I have explored this topic in my previous studies. For instance, in my studies with Reves, we examined the impact of glossing when it is embedded in different reading tasks. And more recently with Lee, I also examined if the impact of input enhancement would vary in two different reading tasks. So I will report the findings in this talk. So firstly, glossing. As I mentioned earlier, glossing is providing the meaning of unfamiliar lexical items in the text margin, and by doing so, promoting healthy reading comprehension and preferably noticing of the four meaning connections of the glossed words. So this is the a theoretical rationale of glossing. So we do glossing, so we hope that learners can notice the glossed items a lot more likely, resulting in learning of those glossed items. But our question was, would the amount of noticing as measured with eye movement vary depending on the amount of task demands? Okay. So more complex tasks requiring more careful reading may change the way of reading processes, because if the reading task requires more careful reading, we would observe more attentive and intensive linguistic processing of the text, which results in more attention to glosses and their gloss target items. That was our hypothesis. So the research questions were, to what extent do the cognitive demands of healthy reading tasks affect reading processes as reflected in their eye movements and stimulate recall comments? And secondly, to what extent do the cognitive demands of certain language reading tasks affect the noticing of glossed linguistic constructions as reflected in participant eye movements and stimulated recall comments? In total, there were 38 participants, and then they read two texts. And while they were reading, the eye movements were recorded with a Tobii eye tracker. And then right after the completion of the reading tasks, 11 participants were asked to produce stimulated comments prompted by their own eye movements. And lastly, they completed exit questionnaire. So the participants of this study were 38 L1 Korean speakers. Their mean age was 27.84, and they were about early advanced level to high intermediate, and they were quite homogeneous. And the two reading texts were textual resources and the Cambrian period. The two texts were very purposefully selected because given that most of our participants were from Faculty of Arts, we assumed that these topics might have been quite unfamiliar to our participants, so that we could effectively cancel out potential topic familiarity effects. So that was the rationale behind the selecting of these two particular texts. And the reading task was ordering text segments while answering multiple choice reading comprehension questions. That is, when they were reading, the text was split into subparts. And in the simple condition, each paragraph split into two text segments. And in the complex condition, each paragraph was split into 3 or 4 text segments, and their job was to determine the correct order of the text segments before they answered the reading comprehension questions. In the simple condition, all they had to do was determining which one comes first between two text segments, which one comes first between the two, whereas in the complex condition, there were 3 or 4 text segments and they had to reorder them in a coherent order. And complexity conditions and the text were counterbalanced following a 2x2 repeated measures design. So this is the sample task layout for the complex version. As you can see here, there are glosses in the text margin. There is the multiple choice reading comprehension question. And as you can see here, they were asked to rearrange the text segments in the correct order first. And the target constructions. There were grammatical and lexical target constructions. The grammatical target construction was English on accusative verb, as you can see here. English intransitive verbs can be categorized into two. First, unergative, as in married danced, or unaccusative, as in the snow melted. And our focus lied on this unaccusative verb, the snow melted. Because L1 Korean learners have this persistent difficulty in acquiring these features, so we assume that perhaps this is worthwhile to explore how to facilitate their learning of this English unaccusative verbs. And in those two texts, there were 15 target unaccusative verbs in total, and they appeared only once. And there were also 10 pseudo words to see the impact of glossing and task manipulation on L2 lexical learning. And there were 10 lexical items in total from the two texts, 5 in each, and they were all nouns, and they appeared only once. And those target nouns were replaced with pseudo words that followed English orthographic and morphological rules, and all of the 10 pseudo words contained 7 letters and 2 syllables to control the length. And for glossed conditions, they were glossed with Korean translations in the margin of the texts. And to measure their prior knowledge, before they read the two texts, there was a pre-test, which was conducted using a GJT. It was untimed, but their reaction time was measured because it was conducted using E prime. And there were 15 grammatical and 15 ungrammatical target sentences. Target sentences meaning the sentences constructed with the target 15 unaccusative verbs, and then 15 grammatical and 15 ungrammatical distractor sentences. And right after the reading, we conducted simulated recall sessions, which were prompted by the recorded eye movements of their own. And they were instructed to stop the recordings and make comments whenever they want. And the researchers also asked questions such as, what made you to look at the words longer? Why did you read the part again? Why did you refer to the gloss, etc.? And all these sessions were video recorded, and not their faces, but only the computer monitors, because oftentimes participants pointed at the computer screen and they made some comments on the computer screen. So we had to video record all the sessions. And for the eye movement data, for the text processing indices, areas of interest was defined for this text part only. So text only areas of interest reflected their reading processes. Whereas to see their global processing, both text and the reading comprehension items were selected at the same time together. And the hypothesis can be expressed like this. So there were many different read eye movement indices, such as the frequency of fixations, the total number of fixations, as well as the duration of fixations. And for the global processing, those two are included. And for the text processing, in addition to the two, median fixation duration, number of forward saccades, and the number of regressions, median length of forward saccade, and median length of regressions, as well as proportion of regressions were included. And we hypothesized that when reading the complex version, in other words, when they had to reorder more text segments, we may see greater values for most of these indices, except for the median length of forward saccade. The reason behind this is that when they had to perform the complex reading tasks, their reading processes will be interrupted more often, which results in shorter reading eye movements in the form of forward saccades. And for the noticing indices, we defined areas of interest around the target verbs as well as pseudo words and their corresponding glosses. So as you can see here, noticing verbs, noticing glosses of the verbs, noticing pseudo words, and then noticing pseudo word glosses. And for each of these four categories, there were two eye movement indices, that is the number of fixations and the duration of fixations. And as you can expect, when they were performing the more complex version, we expected greater values for all these eye movement indices. And let's see the results. Okay, so it turned out that by examining the post-reading question items, they reported that the complex version, which is rearranging the more text segments, were significantly more demanding. And indeed, time taken for task completion was shown to be significantly longer for the complex version than the simpler one, showing that our task complexity manipulation was successful. And these are the results of the eye movement measures for reading processes. And as you can see here, we could see greater values for number of fixations for both global processing and text processing, as well as greater values for sum of fixation duration, the number of words at case, and the number of regressions under the complex version. In other words, when performing complex versions, we could see significantly greater number of fixations on both tasks as a whole, as shown in the global processing and text part only as well. And we also saw significantly longer fixation durations on text part and significantly greater frequency of forward as well as regressive eye movements, indicating that when they had to perform the complex reading task, they made this conscious and strategic effort to rehearse, consolidate, and remedy their text memory. They had to process the text more intensively and repeatedly and stayed longer on the text, indicating more intensive text processing, reading processing. And when it comes to noticing, we could see greater values for the number of fixations and duration of the fixations for the target verbs under the complex version. And in other cases, we could not see such significant differences. So again, number of eye fixations and sum of fixation durations on the target verbs were greater for the complex versions. And when it comes to the stimulatory comments, when performing complex tasks, participants reported more frequently about experiencing difficulty, feeling not very confident, using diverse reading strategies such as careful reading or reading, depending on lexical cues such as they depended on keywords, they depended on pronouns, they relied on traditional words, and etc. And they said they paid closer attention to sentence cohesion because they had to reorder them. And also they referred more to the target unaccusative, which is quite noticeable. So in sum, out of these hypotheses that we made, for these cases, we could find evidence from the data. That is the number of fixations for both global and text processing, as well as the number of eyes forward and as well as regressive eye movements under the complex version. And also, stimulatory comments were overall in line with the findings, eye movement findings. That is, we could see more frequent comments on utilizing diverse reading strategies and more extensive use of lexical and discourse cues. And more importantly, they made more comments on the target unaccusative verbs. But it is also noteworthy that there were insignificant impact on the impact of task complexity on some of these indices. And we assumed that perhaps these indices are more susceptible to task type rather than task complexity, because different task type may require qualitatively different reading processes, so which is worthwhile to be addressed in the future studies. And when it comes to noticing, we could see that the manipulation of task had impact on noticing of the target verbs, but not really on noticing of the glosses or the lexical items, pseudo-words. And indeed, more often we could see the comments on the target unaccusative verbs. But again, when it comes to insignificant influence of task complexity, for the verb glosses, it should be noted that what the participants not know was the unaccusative usages of the verbs. For instance, in the case of collect, they knew the meaning of the collect as a prototypical meaning of the verb. But what they were unfamiliar with is its usage as an unaccusative verb. So because they were already familiar with the prototypical meanings of the target verbs, they may felt less need to refer to the glosses of the target verbs. And pretty much at the same time, target pseudo-words and their glosses, what I have to mention is that they were not that crucial in determining the right order of sentence segments. So they may have, again, felt less need to refer to the glosses and the pseudo-words in the process of reading. So they were not essential for successful task completion. So in sum, yes, it seems task demands have some impact on the amount of noticing triggered by glossing, because more complex reading tasks promote more attentive and intensive text processing, and it resulted in more attention to the glossed verbs. But what we also need to consider is that, as Kakin and Hyuna mentioned, task relevance in sentence processing, in other words, pseudo-words were not really attended by the learners because they were not that essential in task completion. So we need to consider this very seriously in the task design of the future studies. And I also conducted another study because I was curious if the impact of task demands on noticing of the glossed constructions would also found in the actual amount of L2 learning. So here, my question was, in this part, the impact of differing amount of task demands on the impact of glossing on learning of the glossed constructions. So again, more complex tasks may require more attentive and intensive linguistic processing of the text, and assume that perhaps this will lead to greater amount of learning of the target constructions. So the research question was, to what extent do cognitive demands of reading tasks, glossing, and their interaction affect development in the target L2 grammatical as well as lexical knowledge? Here I recruited 88 L1 Korean speakers. They were pretty much similar to, comparable to the ones in the previous study. And again, the way I conducted glossing and manipulating the reading tasks were largely the same. So the target constructions, in other words, English unaccusative verbs and the 10 pseudo words were glossed in the text margin, and the reading tasks were the same. In the sample condition, each paragraph was split into two, and what the participants had to do was determine which comes first between the two. And in the complex version, they were split, each paragraph was split into 3 or 4, and they had to reorganize them along a coherent order. But the different part in this study is that there was pre-test as well as a post-test. So there was also a GETA test, but in this case, in addition to 15 and grammatical and 15 ungrammatical target sentences, in other words, sentences that were made with the target on accusative verbs, there were additional GETA items that involved new on accusative verbs because I wanted to see if the learning could transfer to novel cases. And for the pseudo word recognition ability, there were 24 recognition items and 20 meaning recognition items. And the 24 recognition items asked the participants if they remembered seeing the word while reading the text. And all they had to do was simply checking yes or no as soon as possible. And there were also 20 meaning recognition items. So as you can see here, it was in the multiple choice format. They were provided with the target pseudo word. And then there were 4 options. 1 was the correct meaning of the word, and 2 were the meanings of the other pseudo words. And then number 4 was always I don't know, because I emphasize that they should not guess, and they should be honest in their responses. And because and for both form and meaning recognition items, 10 target pseudo words and 10 distractor pseudo words were included. So in total, 20 were made. And 1 week later, there was a delayed post test because I wanted to see if the impact, to see the long-term impact of the task manipulation, and they finally completed the exit questionnaire. So let's take a look at the results. Firstly, descriptive stat for reading comprehension scores. And this is the table that shows the reading comprehension scores. And it turned out that both task manipulation and the glossing had no significant impact on the amount of reading comprehension scores. Some of you may think that this is boring, but I was also happy to see the results because it means that we can change the way learners process the text without having some negative impact on their reading comprehension scores. If their comprehension scores were lower in the complex version or in the glossed version, it is something problematic. But thankfully, the reading comprehension was not affected by this task manipulation. And when it comes to the GETA scores, as you can see here, these are the scores for the target verbs, meaning the unaccusative verbs that were contained in the reading passages, and the novel unaccusative verbs that were not included in the the reading passages. And again, the reason that I included these novel verbs to see if the learning from the target unaccusative verbs could be transferred to these novel cases. And the findings were, I could see that their GETA scores were significantly greater when they performed the complex versions, but these facilitative impact of task manipulation was found only for the immediate post-test. That is, this positive impact disappeared in the delayed post. Although this descriptive table shows that their scores were indeed higher for these complex versions, but unfortunately, it was not high enough to make statistical significance. But you can still see that the scores are quite higher for these complex versions, which is in line with the previous eye movement study. Because in that study, when they were reading the complex version, they indeed more likely to notice the target unaccusative verbs. And they also made more comments on the target unaccusative verbs in the stimulate the recall session. And this GETA data supports that. They were in line. They complete each other, the picture. So I was happy to see this result. And when it comes to the learning of the pseudo words, here you can see the form recognition scores and meaning recognition scores for immediate and delayed post tests. And I saw some interesting results. That is, form recognition scores were shown to be lower for the glossed versions. In other words, when they read the text in their glossed versions, their form recognition scores were lower. And when it comes to meaning recognition scores, their scores were higher. So when the target words were glossed, form recognition scores were lower, but meaning recognition scores were higher, which was very interesting. And for meaning recognition scores, task complexity had some impact. In other words, when they read the complex version, reordering more text segments had negative impacts on their meaning recognition scores in the delayed post tests. So let's discuss the results. First of all, when it comes to the effect of task demands on learning of accusative verbs, as I mentioned earlier, we could see some significant effects of task complexity on the immediate target gains. And perhaps this may be due to the closer inspection of the text, because they had to read each sentence very carefully, consider the sentence cohesion and logical order of the text segments. So they may have to process sentence very, very carefully and grammatically. And naturally, this might have affected their exposure, the amount of exposure to target on accusative verbs. However, this did not last to the long-term impact, because in the delayed process, even though the raw scores were indeed greater for the more complex version, but it was not greater enough to make significance. And the learning impact did not transfer to the novel verbs. And there could be many reasons to account for this finding. For instance, each of the accusative verbs appeared only once in the text. So it might have not enough to facilitate learning of the, consolidate the learning of their unaccusative verbs. And at the same time, given the nature of this unaccusativity, which is often achieved in the way of item-based learning, I think transfer to the novel verbs might have been not that likely in the beginning. And when it comes to the effect of glossing and task demands on learning of the pseudo words, negative effects were found for the form recognition. That is, again, when they were reading the glossed version, they were less likely to notice recognize the form of the target pseudo words. Perhaps it is because when the target pseudo words were glossed in the text margin, they might have felt less need to inspect the word form to guess their meaning. Because when we encounter a new word, what we usually do is analyzing the new word, for instance, morphologically, guess the meaning of this new word. But when there are glosses right there, we don't have to make that mental effort, mental investment. We can just refer to the meaning of the meaning provided in the glosses. So perhaps that's why their form recognition scores were lower for the glossed versions. And positive impact of glossing and negative impact of task complexity on meaning recognition scores. So positive impact of glossing on meaning recognition scores is something that quite in line with the previous study's findings. So again, glossing has positive impact on lexical learning, especially learning the meaning of the words. Because when we say we know the word, it means that we establish this connection between form and meaning. And indeed, glossing seems to promote this form-meaning connection. But in the case of complex version, they might have under this cognitive pressure that they have less mental resources to process the meaning of these target verbs, which resulted in lower scores, as you can see here, lower scores of meaning recognition in the complex version compared to minus complex versions. So when their mental resources are not enough to process the words, meanings of new words, they were not likely that to acquire these new words. Okay, so what I found is that more complex tasks led to more learning of the unaccusative verbs, which was consistent with the eye movement data. And glossing may have distinct impact on learning of word form versus meaning, which was very interesting. And again, cognitive task demands may manipulate learning of the lexical items at the same time, because we have seen that the scores on the meaning recognition task was lower under the complex version, because they could not enjoy this luxury to acquire these new lexical features, which were not even essential for task completion. And next, input enhancement. In a more recent study with Dr. Lee, we examined the combined impact of input enhancement and task manipulation on learning of algogrammatical features. So we manipulated a reading task in terms of the amount of careful reading needed, and then we assumed that this task manipulation may affect the amount of attention and, as a result, learning of the target constructions. So the research questions were, firstly, to what extent do task manipulation, textual enhancement, and their interaction affect learners' allocation of attention resources on the target linguistic constructions as reflected in their movements? And secondly, to what extent do task manipulation, textual enhancement, and their interaction affect development in grammatical knowledge? And lastly, to what extent does learner attention allocated to the target linguistic construction related to development in grammatical knowledge? And in this study, we recruited 73 L1 Korean speakers, and their average TOEFL score was not that high. We wanted intermediate level learners, high intermediate at the maximum. So their average TOEFL score was 98.27, and the target structure was English participle phrase in its restrictive use, as in two students waiting outside look cold. And the reading text was an English opinion essay. The topic was detrimental impact of various social media on teenagers' development. We selected this article because the content of this reading was very familiar, very common topic. So we assumed that in this way we can cancel out the potential impact of topic familiarity. And 86.6% of the total words were within the 2K word list. And the target participle phrases were enhanced by coloring in red. And the reading task was manipulated in terms of the amount of careful reading required. That is, in the careful reading condition, they were asked to read preparing for an upcoming presentation. And then for the expeditious condition, they had to figure out the gist as fast as they can. And while they were reading the text, their eye movements were collected using Tobii eye tracker. And areas of interest were defined around the target participle phrases. And again, noticing was measured by eye movement captured in those areas of interest using the Tobii eye tracker. And to see the impact of this task manipulation and input enhancement on learning, we developed a GETA test. It contained 32 target items and 48 distractors. And to cancel out any of these practice effects, we made 4 test versions, which were counterbalanced using a Latin square design. And a subset of the participants, 20 participants, further participated in a stimulatory session and the entire stimulatory session was video recorded. And again, their faces were not recorded. Only the computer monitor was recorded to capture the participants pointing at the monitor. And then lastly, there was the exit questionnaire. So let's take a look at the attention measures, which is fixation durations as measured with in seconds, and then fixation counts, frequency. And then as we can see here, for the enhanced versions, we could see significantly greater amount of total fixation duration as well as fixation counts captured for the target constructions. There was target participle phrases, and at the same time, significantly greater fixation durations as well as fixation counts for careful conditions. In other words, both input enhancement, there was red coloring, and careful reading had some positive impacts on noticing the target constructions. As you can see here, in the case of the enhanced plus careful condition, the number was the most significant. As you can see here, 1.17 and 5.78. So in this condition, the indices were the greatest. What about GJT scores? Unfortunately, we could not see any of significance from the GJT scores. In other words, both input enhancement and task manipulation did not affect their GJT scores, unfortunately. But also, it was an interesting finding for us. And when it comes to the correlations between the amount of attention and their GJT scores, again, we could not see any significant correlation between the two, meaning the amount of attention captured in the target participle phrases may not be related to their learning as measured with the GJT score, GJT test. And this is the coding results of stimulatory comments. Red coloring means, as you can see here, the example comments, I paid attention because they were highlighted in red. So when they were paying more attention to the target items, and they say that it was because of the enhancement, it was because of the red coloring, it was coded as red coloring. Unfamiliar words, when they said, I didn't know the meaning of this word, it was marked as unfamiliar word, and no reason. There was no specific reason. I looked at that part just because. And then no memory. I don't remember that I made such eye movements. And as you can see here, more annotations were made for the enhanced conditions and careful conditions. And as you can see here, when they had to read very fast, and when the target participle phrases were not colored, then no noticeable eye movements were found, and they made no stimulatory comments. And what was also interesting to us is that many times the number is not ignorable. As you can see here, there were quite a many number of comments saying there was no reason, or they even do not remember making that kind of eye movements, which was very interesting for us. So when it comes to the eye movement data, again, input enhancement is an effective attention trigger. So it is effective to attract learners' attention to morphosyntactic features, so targets, lexical features. But does it necessarily lead to actual learning? That's the question. And task manipulation also promoted attention to the target constructions. And again, as I mentioned earlier in my previous studies, more attention paid to the target constructions when reading to prepare for a presentation. And participants were more likely to engage in more intensive and recursive reading processes to establish a highly coherent and accurate text representation. Because in order to be prepared for a presentation, they had to fully understand the given text, which resulted in more careful reading. And in so doing, they were more likely to make eye fixations on the target participle phrases. And in the stimulatical comments, interestingly, participants often did not remember why they looked at the target constructions for noticeably long. They could not recall. And this may indicate that, together with the lack of impact of the glossing and task input enhancement and task manipulation on the GJ scores, it may indicate that eye movement data provides information on lower level and attentional processes, whereas stimulatory recall unveil higher level and metacognitive processes under volitional control, and which is verbalizable, right? And given that, perhaps the impact of input enhancement and task manipulation in this study were effective to make some changes at the lower level and attentional processes as reflected in the movement data, but they were not enough to make changes at the level of awareness, higher level processes, which is reflected in the similar comments as well as GJT scores. So again, no impact of input enhancement, which means perceptual saliency of input did not result in promoting the development of the target structure. And most of the comments in the stimulated recall indicated the participants noticed the target items, but none of them identified a particular use of them. In other words, as Liao has repeatedly claimed, L2 learning is attributable to a higher level processing at the level of awareness, as reflected in the, for instance, similar recall comments, rather than a lower level attention resources as reflected in the eye movement data in this particular study. And when it comes to the null impact of task manipulation on learning, to provide a scenario, that is, you are reading this text to prepare for an upcoming presentation. Even in this complex condition, the sole reading purpose was to extract the meaning propositions rather than paying attention to forms. Even in the careful reading condition, in other words, it was meaning-based, and it might have short-circuited syntactic processing of the target constructions. This is something different from the previous studies, because in my previous studies, task manipulation had some significant impact, not only in the eye movements, but also in the GJT scores. But in those cases, a task was reordering text segments into a coherent order. So they had to process each sentence very, very carefully and accurately, which so naturally promoted syntactic processing of each sentence. So it had a positive impact on L2 learning, which was not the case in this study. So task manipulation that encourages focus on both meaning and forms might have yielded somewhat different results. So in sum, both input enhancement and task manipulation played as attention trigger. They triggered attention, but they were not enough to extend the impact on learning as reflected in the GJT scores. And target features may have not been task essential again, and the reading task was too meaning focused, perhaps. So in sum, the general discussion, glossed items, as shown in my previous studies, they are more likely to be noticed if they are relevant to the goal of the reading task. That's why the target unaccusative words were more likely to be noticed, but it was not the case for the pseudo words. And input enhancement attracts L2 readers' attention, but in alone may have limited impact on L2 learning and hence need additional device to boost its efficacy. And task manipulation can encourage L2 readers to make conscious and strategic efforts to achieve the goal, which results in more attentive processing of the task-relevant sentences. So when there is a specific goal for reading that encourages more careful reading and preferably a greater need to process, to engage in syntactic processing of the sentences. And when the glossed and enhanced constructions are relevant to the task goal, more learning may occur. And so I wanted to highlight the importance of task relevance and task manipulation in the direction of attracting more attention to the more need for the syntactic processing again. And implications of these studies may be summarized as, firstly, task manipulation can alter the way L2 readers process and respond to task input. And more research into task effects on learners' processes in input-based tasks are required and is required. And I'm indeed designing more studies along this venue. And then the impact of textual modification can trigger attention, but there may not be enough, and more research into the impact of task relevance to encourage deeper processing of the target constructions is needed. So again, I think research into the combined impact of task manipulation and textual modification in the form of glossing or input enhancement will be very informative and insightful. And it was shown that real-time process, such as eye tracking measures, combined with stimulated recall comments, provide us with fuller and more nuanced understanding about the reading processes, attentional processes, as well as the results of those processes on learning. So in sum, pedagogically speaking, when we design our the L2 reading task, we may need to be very careful because, again, as I mentioned in the very earlier slide, our goal is to promote these dual goals of L2 reading. One is improving their reading comprehension skills, but they may not be enough. We need one more, that is facilitating L2 learning from engaging in L2 reading tasks. Thank you very much for attending this talk. It was very happy to share the findings of my previous studies. And if you have any suggestions and questions, please contact me. Thank you very much.